In this part of the lecture, we'll be looking at Inventory Management 101, which means the basic concepts of inventory management. So what is inventory management? Basically, it's about the management of inventory, which we'll define later, mostly products, but it also includes things like information such as orders or demand forecasts, as well as finances, so paying for the products. And you also have to manage including the ordering, the producing, the storing, the transporting of these products. Sometimes people prefer to use the term supply chain management or logistics, but basically these are the same. These are all referring to the same thing. And inventory management here, it shows this is the so-called downstream. The usual flow of products go downstream, and also sometimes products or information finances needs to flow upstream as well. And if you think about companies like Apple, where typically you buy products from Apple, but nowadays you can actually return, for example, your iPhone and get it perhaps resold or possibly recycled into making new iPhones. So products also might have to flow backwards. So let's use Walter White, who is a character from the famous TV series Breaking Bad, as an interesting inventory management case study. So he was formerly a meek high school science teacher, but after he got cancer, he decided to become a ruthless player in the meth drug trade. Meth is basically a type of recreational drug which is illegal and highly addictive. So he had to face rather interesting inventory management problems, such as how do you get raw materials, how do you transport your finished goods, how do you safely store your goods and your cash, how to communicate orders with suppliers and customers without being caught by the cops, and how do you transfer money or receive money and make and pay out money to other people as well. So of course, when you're doing something illegal, that's the inventory management issues or problems become much greater. And I want to emphasize, say no to drugs. This is just for the purposes of illustration. Obviously, you shouldn't become an illegal drug dealer, and that's not what I'm teaching you at all. I also wanted to mention that nowadays a lot of the information and finances is actually done through the internet for information and the banking system for finances. So it's more about the flow of the products that still has to be handled physically, using trucks, trains, airplanes, and so on. Okay, so now let's move on to what is inventory. Inventory basically refers to materials that are consumed, that is used up in the process of producing products or serving customers. And because these materials are used up, then you need to reorder the inventory frequently. And the inventories also can be referred to as consumables or stock. So here I want to distinguish between inventory versus equipment or assets. Let's use the example of a dairy farmer. Basically, that's someone who produces and sells milk. Now, I mean not someone who produces milk, by himself, but using cows, of course. So you would have, if you're a dairy farmer, you'll have a herd of cattle, and these cattle will form your equipment or your assets. And you also need to manage your feed, that means the food that these cattle consume. And typically, a cow can produce milk for 12 to 18 months after giving birth. But the same cow is not consumed in the production of milk, but the feed gets consumed every day, and every day you need to give new feed to the cows, or else they won't be able to produce milk after a short period of time. So that's the difference between the equipment or assets which are not consumed in the manufacturing process and the inventory which is consumed and needs to be regularly replenished. In inventory management, there are two basic problems: stockouts and overstocking. So stockouts occur when you don't have enough inventory. So this is a photo showing empty supermarket shelves before Hurricane Sandy in 2012. So this is not the Sandy who taught the first part of this course. It's this major hurricane event where I think over 200 people died, and there was a huge storm that affected the east coast of the United States and other countries around that region. So before the hurricane, just before the hurricane arrived, many people went to supermarkets to buy lots and lots of bottled water. And it was sold out, so some customers were not able to get the products or the bottled water that they want. So that's the problem of stockouts. The second problem is that of overstocking. Here's an example. So Snap, the company which makes Snapchat. I know Snapchat used to be super popular. Nowadays, I know TikTok is the new hot thing. And I guess I'm not hot enough to use TikTok or Snapchat, although I do use Instagram. Anyhow, Snapchat produced a product called Spectacles. So this part of the Spectacles is actually a video camera. And this is an indicator light which shows when the camera is recording. So Snapchat wanted to produce this product and sell it to customers so that they would record videos and post it to Snapchat. But unfortunately, this product did not sell well, so Snapchat basically had excess inventory that they could not sell, and they had to write it down, basically consider it as a loss, and try to liquidate the inventory. So the objective of inventory management is to have neither too much nor too little, but to have just the right amount of inventory. So you want to find a happy medium between the too much and the too little. So now let's look at the types of inventory. So here are 4 types of inventory. The first is raw materials and component parts. So these are the raw ingredients that you need as direct inputs to produce your products or to serve your customers. Work in process inventory refers to inventory that is in the midst of being produced. So it's not finished yet. And obviously, finished goods inventory refers to products that are finished and done. So they are ready to be purchased by customers or consumed by customers. The last category is MRO inventory, which stands for maintenance, repair, and operating supplies. So this refers to inventory that's not required as direct inputs to produce the company's products, but nevertheless, it's often required indirectly by the company. So this refers to things such as light bulbs, printer cartridges, toilet paper, pens, and so on. Right? So typically that's not direct inputs into what the company makes, but you need it to kind of keep the facilities and to keep operations running. And here's a very simple diagram that shows the difference between raw materials, work in process, and finished goods. I think it's mostly self-explanatory, so I'm going to skip it. So now let's move on to why companies hold inventory. So what are the reasons for companies to hold inventory? So companies want to balance supply and demand. For example, the demand for potatoes or French fries is basically flat. But if you think about the demand for the production, the supply of potatoes, because there's a growing season, so what that means is that most of the time there are no potatoes being harvested. But during the growing season, suddenly you have a huge spike of potatoes being harvested. So once during that spike, the companies will process and store these potatoes, and slowly the inventory depletes over time as the potatoes get consumed by the population. So companies need to hold this inventory to balance the kind of huge spikes in supply compared to the regular flat demand. The second example is the economies of scale in production, purchasing, and transportation. So this picture here shows a very large crude carrier. Let me see, can I see the notes? Let's see. Okay, I wasn't able to see. Okay, this is how I showed it. So here's a very large crude carrier. If you see, it's in the notes. A very large crude carrier can carry more than 2 million barrels of crude oil. So what does that mean? Basically, when China buys crude oil from Iran, for example, the oil will be transported in such a very large crude carrier. And you can see that this ship is huge, and next to it are smaller ships, which are actually pretty big ships too. So you can just imagine how big this is. So because it's much cheaper to transport a huge amount of crude oil all at once. So if you transport using this huge ship, the cost per unit of transportation is cheaper. So due to this, when China receives 2 million barrels of oil, it can't immediately consume this oil. It stores it in inventory and slowly, depletes the inventory over time. For reasons 3 and 4, I'm going to use this sweater as an example. So companies such as The Gap, will typically face 6 to 9 months of lead time to produce their clothes. So what this means is they have to produce sweaters long in advance of whether they know how much demand there is for that style and that color. So because of the lead time in supply and the uncertainty in the demand, they have to produce it in advance and hope that they guessed the right amount of that what they produced is similar to the actual demand from customers. Finally, in this picture, we show a wine cellar. So when wine is very good, it will appreciate in value over time. So I think if it ages a few years, the price of the wine that you can sell it for increases. So people will store wine because you're gaining value or gaining money. Okay, now let's look at the costs related to inventory. There are the carrying or holding costs, so the cost of storage. There's the transportation costs. There's the order cost. So sometimes when you get orders from a supplier, it costs money. So if you look at the ship, for example, China places an order from Iran. This is sort of a transportation. I guess that includes the order and the transportation costs. There's a setup cost. So if you are changing between what you produce, for example, this is dried pasta. If you switch between different types of dried pasta, the oven may require different temperatures to produce these different types of pasta. So you need to leave the oven idle when you're switching the temperature and switching the products. So that's a setup cost. Finally, the stockout or shortage cost includes lost sales, so money you didn't make because customers were not able to buy the products that were out of stock, and also damage to your company's reputation, which is more of an intangible cost. So for example, if you go to a supermarket and it's out of your favorite products, after a while you might just give up going to that supermarket and go to another one instead. So how do we measure supply chain performance? We'll be looking at 2 key metrics. The first one is the so-called service level. So in Wikipedia, they have an article about service levels, and they talk about different measures. So these 2 measures are actually more relevant to service settings, whereas these are more relevant for products. And for this class, the most relevant definition would be the percentage of customers that do not experience a stockout. So roughly speaking, that's the percentage of demand that you're able to satisfy. And companies typically want to achieve pretty high service levels for most normal products, like 90-95%, because that allows you to satisfy most of your demand and capture most of the revenue that you could have attained. The second key metric is something called inventory turnover, and this basically means the number of times that the inventory is sold or used in a time period such as a year. And this metric basically can be used to see if the company has a problem with excess inventory relative to its sales. So here's an example to illustrate what the inventory turnover means. So suppose that a particular store sells 600 units of a product every year, and the average inventory level is 100 units. So let's say that there's a shelf with all the products of that category, and on average it's 100, and the store sells 600 units a year. So in a sense, the store is selling out and replacing the shelf 6 times a year. So it sells 6 shelves a year, so the inventory turnover is 6 turns. So if you keep the service level the same, what you want as a company is to have a higher inventory turnover, which corresponds to lower inventory holding costs. So because you don't have to have higher inventory turnover means you have less inventory because the sales is the same. And you also, so if your company has high inventory turnover, that's a clue, an indication that your company has lower inventory holding costs. One important thing to note is that inventory turnover depends a lot on the product and the industry. So if you think about this, which has a higher inventory turnover, the iPhone or the MacBook Pro? And we can discuss that. Or which retailer do you expect to have high inventory turnover? Taste Supermarkets or Chao Sang Sang Jewelry? And we should discuss that too. So a naive student might wonder, should we try to have 100% service level? Satisfy all the demand? So if you want 100% service level, the problem is you will need a lot of inventory. And that would lead to very low inventory turnover and very high inventory costs. So in practice, you can't have everything. You just want to have a good enough service level. That means you want to satisfy most of your demand. And you want a reasonable inventory level so that your inventory turnover is high and your inventory holding costs are relatively low. Alright, so that's it for this part of the lecture. See you in the next part.